Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that. Welcome to the next session, which is on independent media in conflict-afflicted regions. My name is John Whittingdale. I'm a Member of Parliament. I chair the All-Party Media Freedom Group in Parliament. And I'm delighted to welcome an extremely expert panel this morning. Just a few words of introduction. We're talking about the importance of journalism reporting from war zones, and it is worth just paying tribute, I think, to Paul Conroy, who died at the end of last week. Paul did an immense amount following the death of his colleague Marie Colvin in Syria, which was a deliberately targeted attack on Marie Colvin as a journalist, and he, after her death, went round, and I listened to him speak about the courage and necessity of journalism from war zones. Sadly, this session is taking place at a time when conflict is raging around the world. Obviously, we're paying a great deal of attention to events in the Middle East, even more so than recently, and I'm sure that Liz will talk a bit about the role of the World Service there, and we know of the bravery of the journalists, both of the BBC Persian Service and Iran International, based here, who are subject to horrendous harassment. But even now, journalists are risking their lives by bringing to the rest of the world what is happening there. Same has been happening in Gaza, although, in my view, very unfortunately, Israel did not allow journalists in. I think that was a great mistake. But most of all, I'm delighted that we also have with us as our first speaker, Sergei Tomilenko from Ukraine. Journalism in Ukraine has been under attack by Russia. RSF produced an extremely worrying report about attacks on hotels targeted because they contain journalists. I'm sure Sergei will tell us a bit more about his experience in reporting and his colleagues reporting from the front line in Ukraine. So, Sergei, if I can invite you to start.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, thank you, Sir John. It's a great honor to me to be here, and but I want to mention that when we speak about conflict-affected regions, for Ukraine, this is not a conflict. For us, this is a full-scale war. I arrived in London a few days ago, and I am staying near the Frontline Club here at Paddington. And for 3 nights in my hotel room, I have kept the heating at 23 degrees. And still I can't feel warm. Because this winter, as you know, Kyiv was the hardest winter during war. Since January, Russia has intensified attacks on energy infrastructure. In my apartment, heating stopped 3 times during freezing temperatures. And our National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, located in central Kyiv, stood for a week without heating and without water. Electricity comes by schedule, and we are lucky if the schedule is respected. Often, we have no power for 15 to 17 hours a day. So, here in London, lights is bright in my room, heating works, and I realize how fragile these things are. So this is a reality from which I traveled to this forum. In wartime, independent journalism is not only about democratic values. It becomes part of our national resilience. If trusted information disappears, if media disappears, propaganda, disinformation fills the space. At the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine, we prioritize support for regional, for local, and frontline media, especially for frontline press. Since 2022, we have helped revive and sustain more than 40 newspapers in frontline and their occupied regions. In my hands is one example, the newspaper Zarya from Kharkiv region. Its editor, Vasyl Miroshnik, personally delivers these copies to villages close to the border with Russia. And he delivers it under the threat of Russian drones. Recently, we provided special drone detection device to him to help him stay safe while distributing the paper. For many communities, frontline newspapers, as you see, it's such old-fashioned one media, but such newspapers are the only reliable source of verified information. And when towns, when villages are in darkness, these newspapers become a stable point of truth. In Ukraine, journalists continue to work as civilians under extremely dangerous conditions. At the same time, many of my colleagues have been mobilized and now defend the country with weapons in their hands. We speak today about serious losses within our media community. Since February 2022, 144 media workers have been killed. 21 were killed while directly performing their professional duties as journalists. In 2025 alone, 3 media workers were killed, all in Russian drone attacks. Ukrainian journalists are also documenting war crimes and human rights abuses, often at great personal risk. Today, 28 Ukrainian journalists remain in Russian detention. One of them is Irina Levchenko. She is a member of my union, National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. She is a famous journalist from now temporarily occupied Zaporizhia region. She was missing, or she was detained by Russians in May 2023. For almost 2 years, there was no communication. Recently, we received a short letter from her from Russian prison. Just a few lines, but now it's proof that she is alive. Detained journalists must not disappear from diplomatic attention. Their names should be raised consistently in international forums and monitoring mechanisms. Protecting journalists in wartime is not only about media freedom, it's about human dignity and accountability. Russia combines military aggression with systematic disinformation. Attacks on infrastructure directly affect media operations. Without electricity, newsrooms can't function, equipment can't be charged, and reports can be transmitted. This winter, requests from journalists to rent drone detectors increased 5-fold. Requests for secure workspaces with stable electricity tripled. We, as union, we created our network of journalist solidarity centers as some of hotline to support journalists during war. And now our network operates drone detector rental points in 3 frontline regions. These centers function as operational safety hubs. They provide protective equipment, safety training, secure workspaces, legal and psychological support. Since 2022, more than 9,000 journalists have received assistance from our network. But today, however, we face a serious funding challenge. And yet demand continues to grow. So maintaining safe operational spaces requires predictable and flexible support. This is practical infrastructure that allows independent reporting to continue. Let me suggest 3 practical steps. First, ensure that detained journalists are systematically included in all diplomatic negotiations and monitoring mechanisms. Second, support the creation and sustainability of safe operational spaces for journalists working in conflict zones, working in war. And third, establish rapid and flexible funding mechanisms for frontline and local media operating under extreme risk. Independent journalism in war requires infrastructure, not only courage. Supporting, it's not only solidarity, it's an investment in democratic resilience and security. Journalists in Ukraine are not asking for sympathy. We are asking for the tools and safe conditions to continue our work. If independent journalism survives war, truth survives. And when truth survives, democracy has a chance to endure. Thank you, dear friends. I am happy to be here, and journalists are important.
Sergei, thank you very much. Thank you for making what I know is a very difficult journey to get here. But much more important, thank you for all that you are doing, yourself and all your colleagues, and the bravery you're showing in bringing the truth to the world, what is happening in Ukraine. We're going to move on. Liz Gibbons is next, who is the acting controller of global journalism at the World Service. The World Service plays a vital role in terms of truth and reliable reporting against a barrage of disinformation and propaganda from rival institutions. I regard it as absolutely vital today, more so than ever. So Liz, over to you.
Thank you, Sir John, and thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. It was really sobering to hear what Sergei had to say, and it's a reminder of what journalists in Ukraine are facing on a daily basis, and thank you for making the trip over here to remind us of all of that. So as John said, I'm the controller of global journalism at the BBC World Service, and as part of that role, I run the teams that deliver long-form and short-form original journalism for 43 languages across the world, including English. So that includes documentaries and investigations, including the Eye Investigations brand, which some of you may be familiar with, Africa Eye, and also more recently we've started a weekly showcase of the best of the BBC World Service journalism on BBC Two every Monday, and that's called Global Eye. What I want to persuade you of in the next few minutes is that the work of independent international public service media in places affected by conflict in all its forms has never been more difficult or dangerous, but it's also never been more important. If trusted news is the front line in the war against misinformation and disinformation, we are truly face to face with the enemy. We all know the context that we work in is currently a case of only ever bad news, but the starkest statistic for me in the RSF 2025 Media Freedom Index is that today less than 1% of the world's population is fully guaranteed press freedom, and only 8% of the world have a media that is classed as satisfactory, which actually includes the UK in that category. For the World Service, that means that 74% of our audience is now in countries with the lowest press freedom. And as you would expect, people are coming to us in their hours of greatest need, in situations of violent conflict, being top of an ever-expanding list. And it's no coincidence that our two biggest global audience peaks for the year so far have been at the start of the war with Iran and the US attack on Venezuela. I'm sure you all know this, but the BBC is blocked, jammed, throttled, and subject to shutdowns in an escalating number of countries: China, Russia, Turkmenistan, parts of Vietnam. We face real difficulties in places like Ethiopia, Myanmar, and Afghanistan. And war is always a time when these threats to accessing us increase, but they also persist when the guns fall silent. In Iran, 1 in 4 adults use BBC News Persian in some form every week. That's despite the fact that we are banned in Iran. And right now we know that satellite access to BBC Persian is restricted and the internet is down. So reaching those audiences that we know need us becomes incredibly challenging. So that's the challenges of being the audience for our journalism. Well, what about the challenges of those faced who are bringing that journalism to our audience? So the journalists face so many challenges. I'll talk about investigative journalism in a minute and the specific issues there and why we at the World Service put so much focus on investigative journalism, but more broadly, even the challenges of delivering news reporting, not only in times of war, are getting harder and harder. So John talked about blocking of access to foreign news media. That means that increasingly the BBC is having to rely on freelancers to bear the brunt of risk in war situations. We are not able to access Gaza as independent journalists, so we are reliant on local journalists, and nearly half of all journalists killed in 2025 were Palestinians in Gaza. As Sergei's already mentioned, in Ukraine, the Russian army continues to target foreign and Ukrainian reporters, and Sudan has also emerged as an exceptionally deadly war zone for the news profession. The other issue we face within the BBC is that many of our World Service journalists increasingly are working in exile. So that includes absolutely everyone who works for BBC News Persian. They're not able to return to Iran. And now our entire BBC News Russian team, 7 of whom have been deemed enemies of the state, and most of them are now working either in Riga or London or other parts of the world because they cannot return to Russia. A number of our journalists have had to go into hiding, and their colleagues and families can face campaigns of harassment and threat. And online, there are threats there too, especially to women and in person as well. And this is no less complex when it comes to investigative journalism, where we try very hard to shine a light in the darkest corners. The risks can be immense, and those risks are risks to BBC teams, both those involved in the investigative journalism and also those who might be caught in it by association. The risk to networks of freelancers we work with we are incredibly reliant on, and also to contributors who are brave enough to talk to us. So a few recent examples from the teams that I work with. So last year we produced a documentary from Kenya, which pieced together video footage from protests outside Parliament to pinpoint who in the security services were responsible for the deaths of non-violent protesters that day. So we knew that this work would be risky, so we went to great lengths to protect the sources. We were very careful about who we named on the credits. By mid-morning on the day of publication, millions of people had already watched the documentary on YouTube, and it had already been picked up on local TV channels. So the news was out there. But the venue where we were due to hold a screening was pressured into cancelling the screening. Freelancers who were nothing to do with the project were arrested on suspicion of involvement. And even pre-TX, there was some anticipation of this because we knew that there was some footage that we wanted to get hold of in order to be able to tell our story. And some of the people that we asked to acquire footage from, and some of these were organisations rather than individuals, were concerned about giving us that material, fearful of the repercussions. In some ways, the impact was the opposite in a sense, because what happened was that the fact of the attempts to sort of ban and suppress the journalism made the journalism even more viral. People started putting on screenings of it in their own communities, and the impact of the attempt to squash it was that more and more people wanted to access it. In recent days in Nepal, we've run a similar investigation, and there's also been a campaign to discredit that work that we did to look at the impact of violence that broke out in Gen Z protests and the crackdown which led to the deaths of innocent people. And there's been claims in Nepal that we've been politically motivated, that we've been in breach of electoral law for putting the investigation out. Similarly, in Georgia, we did an investigation into the use of banned chemicals in protests. We faced threats of legal action from the ruling party, and again, a suggestion that the BBC was following a malign agenda. The Georgian PM called the investigation deep state retaliation for Tbilisi's refusal to follow orders. And an anti-disinformation site called Myth Detector did an investigation after our investigation and found that a number of bots had been created on social media using stolen profiles to spread disinformation about the documentary that we had made. There's also physical threats to teams. So a couple of years ago, our team went into Libya to investigate the disappearance of an influential cleric called Musa al-Sadr. The team were in the country with the correct visas. It was known what we were trying to do. They had a government minder. Nonetheless, the team was still picked up and detained for a number of days in prison and then deported. We were able, in the end, to broadcast that material, but it was some years later that we were able to actually feel safe enough to broadcast that. Obviously, we take measures to mitigate. Journalists are often working under pseudonyms. We are very careful about how and who we credit in material. We are increasingly reliant on citizen journalism, which obviously potentially carries risks for those people who are brave enough to film material on our behalf. Last year, we were able to get some material from people who were brave enough to film on mobile phones in Al Fasher in Sudan. When it was under attack, we were able to smuggle mobile phones into Al Fasher and get that material out. But then obviously we couldn't broadcast that until we knew that the people that had filmed for us were safely out of the country. We're also using anonymization, which is another tool. It's not always foolproof, though, so we're having to work on AI to cover identification and signaling very carefully to the audience where we do that. We've talked a bit about Russia. It's very difficult to operate there at all. We were able to infiltrate a Russian influence operation in Moldova ahead of the election. We put somebody undercover into a Russian influence operation and obviously had to seriously consider the safety of the team that did that. We often have to consider moving contributors and reporters to a place of safety around the time that we broadcast material, and then also we have to look at other ways to do journalism in places we simply can't get to, which is why we increasingly use open source material to do the work that we do. But obviously there's still a huge amount of risk involved in all of those, despite the mitigations that I have mentioned. So you may well ask, well, why do we take such risks? Well, it's simple, really. It goes to the heart of the purpose of the World Service, providing impartial, accurate news, speaking truth to power, and ever more importantly, bearing witness, all ensure that we continue to deliver a brand of journalism that can't readily be imitated, manipulated, or faked. And in a world of deep fakes, original journalism is our best weapon against the rising tide of polarizing and divisive propaganda in situations of violent conflict, but also in the face of the war on truth. And it's how we earn and build public trust and how we maintain social cohesion. So it's the responsibility of organisations like the BBC World Service, with our global scale and heft and audience trust, to hold our nerve and stay on the front line of this fight. And we're very grateful to those people who help us and support us in that fight. Only this week, the leaders of the BBC, FT, Guardian, Sky and Telegraph joined forces to defend the very principle of original journalism. In a world without the BBC, not only would audiences lose our journalism, but it would be so much easier for malign actors, people who want to evade and erase and distort, and there are many of those, not just the obvious ones, to pick off smaller media, and so much harder for that same media and those freelancers that we work with and that we rely on so much to do their brilliant and courageous original journalism. And we only have to look at recent events at the Washington Post, USAGM's withdrawal of funding for international news media, to know that the threats are very real. And that is why I think the role that we play is more important than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. We had a debate in Parliament yesterday on foreign affairs. I think every single speaker praised the World Service and stressed how important it is. We weren't able to find out how much money you're getting next year, but we'll keep pressing to try and get an answer. The third member of our panel this morning is Jonathan Price-Casey from Doughty Street Chambers, which does extraordinary work in this field. Jonathan, you're very experienced at international law in this area. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sir John. I have not been in this room for 20 years, and the last time I was here I was a student studying law, and I mentioned this when I came in this morning to a couple of people who are also in the room, and funnily enough, they had the same response. And One had studied law, Charlie Holt, legendary anti-SLAPP campaigner who's somewhere in the room. Another had, Jodie Ginsberg had studied, I think, journalism here, slightly longer ago than me, than I studied law, but we won't go to that. Because I think this room actually hadn't been built when Jodie was here. Anyway, and it reminded me, of course, of the enduring and incredible nexus between the two professions, the legal professional and the profession of journalism. If you ever walk down Fleet Street, Strand, you'll see that in the architecture of buildings. A lot of them still bear the names of the old newspapers or newspaper companies from the last century, and they're sprinkled amongst the Inns of Court, the barristers' chambers, and the pubs used to house both journalists and lawyers. So it's a storied tradition. It wasn't limited to drinking in the same pubs. There's been cases involving journalism and journalism involving cases. But it got me thinking that really now, as lawyers, it's time that we stood up for our brethren in the media professions. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. Not for very long. I'm going to echo and reflect on what Sergey said. It's been beautifully contextualized by Liz's fantastic kind of globe-trotting survey of the challenges faced by the BBC. But then I want to talk about a particular case, the case of Ryan Evans. We go back to Ukraine for Ryan's case. And I want to tell his story in a bit more detail. And I want to explain why that story underscores the need for legal accountability and what we might do to achieve that. So I think I'll start with telling Ryan's story, if I may. I act for Ryan's parents, David and Geraldine. Ryan was born in Wrexham, in Wales, was a soldier in the British Army, and came out and looked for a profession to succeed that. And he ended up, found himself working for Reuters as a security advisor, also producing some editorial content himself. And in August 2024, he was in Ukraine, and on the night of the 24th of August, at around 10:30 p.m., he and 5 Reuters colleagues were staying in the Sapphire Hotel, and it was struck by a ballistic missile fired from Russia, or Russian-controlled Ukraine. And Ryan was killed in the blast. Many others were injured, including several members of his team from Reuters, some quite seriously. And the Hotel Sapphire in Kramatorsk, was relatively close to a front line in a region then still held by Ukrainian forces, but this was a targeted attack. It wasn't an accident. The hotel had operated exclusively as accommodation for the media team since the beginning of the invasion in February 22. It was not a large hotel. It had a total of 12 rooms, all of which were occupied by media workers. It was well known to local residents that the press used the hotel. There were press vehicles parked up, clearly marked in the car park. Those coming in and out of the hotel most frequently were wearing blue helmets, if they were wearing helmets at all. The missile caused huge damage to the small hotel, hit the northeastern side where Ryan's room was, and the first and second floors collapsed. But the strike also caused damage to 17 private houses in the surrounds of the hotel, 6 multi-story residential buildings, 4 businesses, and 1 local administrative building, but not to any military infrastructure or personnel whatsoever. There were no military personnel or equipment at or near the hotel, yet the hotel was targeted. So why is that? Sergey has told you why. Because in Ukraine, independent journalism has become part of the national resilience. But these are civilians, and targeting civilians is a war crime. Now, how do we achieve accountability for such an egregious atrocity as this? I recommend to you a report that Sir John's already mentioned about the targeting of hotels in Ukraine, written by RSF and Truth Hounds, which is a tour de force. It's a tremendous work of forensic discipline and application, and some really good and astute legal analysis. The conclusion of the report is that the 9M723 ballistic missile that hit this hotel is very likely to have been ordered specifically, to have been fired on the hotel in the knowledge that the hotel was being used in the way I've described, by one of several very high-ranking Russian military generals. And that can be said with a high degree of certainty because of knowledge about the internal workings of the Russian army, the fact that this was not a cheap piece of equipment which was targeted at the hotel, and therefore a decision as to its target needed to be taken by people of particular seniority. But these are people who are in the middle of a war in Russia, and difficult to get to them. And I'll come on to a little bit about how that might happen in the future. What I do want to do now is just to air here in this forum the recommendations from the report that I've just discussed that reaches these conclusions, because I think you should all think about these today and tomorrow and hopefully beyond that. And as I said, these recommendations are beautifully contextualized by what we've heard from my colleagues on my left and my right. In order to both prevent and achieve accountability for attacks like that killed Ryan, the report recommends that we should enhance collaboration between the Ukrainian government and media professionals. That's a very practical suggestion. That we should ensure legal recognition and protection for all media workers. This is really institutionalizing the protection on the ground in Ukraine. Where there are attacks, we should prioritize, particularly the Prosecutor General of Ukraine should prioritize investigations into those attacks. Not only the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, but the ICC, International Criminal Court, should really prioritize these sort of investigations and prosecutions if they can be made. Foreign states should do the same, prioritize prosecutions for crimes against journalists. We should look to increase judicial cooperation between states. Ryan, of course, is British. And in normal circumstances, had he been, for example, killed in Greece whilst on holiday, and it was possible to prosecute his killer in this jurisdiction because it wasn't going to happen in Greece, that could happen. Metropolitan Police have a unit for extraterritorial prosecutions, but it's very difficult to do that, and there is very surprisingly little international cooperation, and that needs to improve. They recommend certain practical tips, like updating safety protocols, improving the working conditions for those on the ground in Ukraine by having mandatory written contracts and so on. And I don't want to take up a huge amount of time. I wanted to talk to you about this case. I wanted to talk to you about its implications. I wanted to get you thinking about how both the law and professional media organizations can improve accountability where things go wrong. So what I want to do is I want to finish by citing a quote used by David and Geraldine Evans in remarks they recently gave to the UK Parliament by someone who I've not heard of from a work I don't know, but their name is Lois McMaster Bujold, and it is this, and it's incredibly apt. The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is a duty of the living to do so for them. We are all living. It is our duty to cry out for justice for Ryan and for all of the journalists murdered in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I started by referring to Marie Colvin, who was killed 14 years ago in a targeted attack, and now the example that, Jonathan, you give of Ryan Evans. It is appalling that journalists are now seen as targets in war. Now, my sort of opening question to all three of you really is do you detect that the protections which the law has tried to put in place for journalists are actually proving not just ineffectual, but actually that journalists are increasingly now targeted deliberately for attack in conflicts, obviously in Ukraine, but in others like in Iran and Gaza as well?
No. As we see in Ukraine, for Russian army, for Russians, inscription press, it's targets. And we see, and one of our main advice for foreign journalists who travel from Great Britain or other, for Ukrainian journalists, not use inscription press on safety equipment, on vests, on their cars, automobiles. And it started maybe from 2024. And but we appreciate international solidarity, especially headquarters of UNESCO donated 125 safety sets for us with highest protection and level, but with inscription, with big press. But now we refuse any and use only neutral black and neutral blue safety inscription. But we see that for Russians at frontline regions, all civilians are targets, because after beginning of full-scale invasion, we fixed that maybe targets for Russians was military targets, officers or army or some open military targets. But now, as I shown this newspaper from Kharkiv, I am in touch with my colleagues for whom living at frontline regions is not as a business trip. We appreciate frontline reporters or reporters from different foreign media, but for us, our brave colleagues, it's some business trip. They travel and they go to the newsrooms or other, but I'm in touch with journalists who permanently live at frontline regions, and so for the auditorium, so they fix that for this moment Russian drones deliberately target any civilian infrastructure, and if they fix that it's journalists will be targeted. And I mentioned that last year, 3 journalists, one French photo reporter, Anthony Lolican, and 2 Ukrainian journalists, they were killed by Russian drones. And I discussed with press officers, with representative of chief commanders, and they investigated such every case of killing of journalists. But they explained that that Russian operator or operator of Russian drones, they deliberately fixed that our colleagues were civilians without weapons, equipped with photo cameras or other. So this attacks was attacks on journalists, and for this moment there is no protection for journalists during war.
Yeah, I mean, there is an increase in targeting of journalists, sadly, and I think it's because a lot of people don't see journalists as civilians. Journalists are civilians, but a lot of those perpetrating war and terror consider journalists to be effectively combatants. And this echoes a point that was made by Michaela Wrong in the panel before the break, where she was talking about those in power in parts of Africa in particular, who have learnt how to use propaganda, how to use journalism offensively for their own war-waging purposes. And they therefore don't see a distinction between journalists who are independent, who are carrying out objective, proper public interest journalism, and people who are opposed to them militarily. But it's important, of course, that journalism itself is protected. Journalists are civilians, they should be protected as civilians. Journalism is a pillar of democracy, the cornerstone of a democratic society. It's an essential measure to mitigate the effects of war. And this was, I could go back to what Sergei said so eloquently, which is that independent journalism is part of Ukraine's national resilience. If you're trying to conquer Ukraine, why wouldn't you go after it? I'm afraid.
Yes, it is self-evident. I think that journalists are being increasingly targeted. It's borne out by what we've heard on the panel, the specific examples, and also the statistics, which every year the roll call of journalists killed goes up, and it's sobering. And we've seen targeting not just in Ukraine, but Gaza, as I mentioned, and other places. And I agree with Sergei, there was probably a world 5-10 years ago where you would slap press all over your vehicle, or you'd make it very clear that you were a journalist as a way of trying to protect the work that you were doing. And these days that can make you a target. And that is a real shift in many, many war zones. And the other thing I'd say, which is sort of the corollary to which I mentioned before, some really interesting thoughts from the other panellists about what can be done to sort of improve protections in this area. And the flip side is obviously the other tool that is used by states to prevent journalists doing their work is to prevent people getting into these places. And I do, and that's another sort of, and that can also put local journalists at increased risk of being targeted as well. And I think the work that Sir John, you said at the beginning, and others have done to actually foreground and make very clear that it is unacceptable that journalist organisations are not allowed into places like Gaza, and it's very difficult to get into Sudan. Obviously, Iran also does make a huge difference, and I think that is an area that civil society and politicians could do even more to highlight those requirements and the need to let independent journalists do their work and enter into places and war zones. The people who are able and willing to take those risks and bear witness, we need to encourage that to happen in places where it is currently not happening.
Thank you. We've got time probably for a couple of questions. A few hands. The gentleman there is the first one I saw. Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Hi, my name is Nick Williams from Index on Censorship, and you mentioned Marie Colvin, obviously don't pay tribute to her colleague Paul Conroy, who passed away last week. Also, there's a question about, as you mentioned, BBC's responsibility if to get a journalist out of the country if the situation is so febrile. But then obviously passed on some obligations to safe countries like the UK, and the UK has been wholly inadequate with offering humanitarian visas, safe rescue journalists, maybe not British nationals, but need a place to go. Like, is there any progress or any steps that we should be taking, either civil society or lawyers or policymakers, to ensure that the UK can become a refuge point for journalists who are working in conflict zones, but due to the risks against them, it's too severe for them to stay in, and they need places. I was speaking to an Azerbaijani journalist in Brussels this week, and she got a week left in her visa in Europe and can't go back. Obviously not conflict zone, but incredibly unstable situation for a journalist. Like, is there anything more that we can do in the UK and other safe countries to ensure that these journalists are protected?
I would just quickly say it's something that we have been pressing for some time. The Home Office is the obstacle, but the fact that the UK has just taken back the chair of the Media Freedom Coalition, I think gives us an opportunity to have another go, because you're not talking about waves and waves of migration. You're talking about a small number of people who are terribly at risk. So I don't know if any of the panel would like to add.
I would obviously echo that, and we had to make some very quick decisions for journalists. I've mentioned BBC Russian colleagues, and that was we also brought out a huge number of colleagues from Afghanistan, after the Taliban took over the country again. And actually, I think in that case, we were well supported. But I think your point about independent journalists and freelancers is well made and something I can look into more.
Let's have another question. The gentleman here has had his hand up the whole time.
Yeah, Ewan Grant, UK Defence Forum. I worked extensively in Ukraine. My work is known particularly to Edward Lucas, and I would urge everybody to read his article last week, as well as the latest one, where he said Ukraine was betrayed, which it certainly was. I have myself been threatened. I was warned by an Irish friend that because of something I wrote, people in Cardinal O'Fee's office in the Irish Catholic Church, she was worried they would pass my name and address to the IRA. My question is, many of the organizations carrying out these threats cannot really be prosecuted. They're outside the jurisdiction. So what can be done about coordinated multinational coercive reprisals, I use that word deliberately, against those states because of the limitations of the criminal justice opportunities? I would just also add that the World Service output has been absolute gold dust for my colleagues and myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jonathan, is that one? Perhaps you.
So it's a very kind of fact-sensitive question, and obviously, yeah, but well, I mean, it depends on which jurisdiction you're talking about. As you know, the issue of coercive reprisals against Russia is a hot topic, and obviously the targeting of journalists would be one reason to sanction Russia against many others. And, but if you're talking about jurisdictions, but I have in mind particularly, I mean, you've talked about Sudan being particularly concerning, maybe even Ethiopia, a neighbouring state, is having quite a lot of these sort of difficulties. I mean, recently was happily involved in a number of East African journalists leaving Ethiopia in a great hurry, and one of the happiest recent text messages I've received was from them saying, "Wheels up on our way to Nairobi, thank you." But they were going to Nairobi, and Kenya itself is a fairly checkered history. I think I mean, the idea of sort of targeted coercive reprisals is quite attractive. There are mechanisms in international law, and there are mechanisms in UK and EU law, for example, sanctions, which might be brought to bear in these situations. But of course, these are political decisions. So we need to surface the issue politically, and it was rather like what John was saying about making politicians realise that if you change immigration law so that we can receive those journalists who are not UK nationals but who are under serious threat abroad, you're only talking about a handful of individuals. Of course, politically, I would imagine at the moment, making anything, liberating the immigration system in any way is going to be difficult. So I don't quite know how you do that. But good luck, John. That's why you're there and I'm not. So I think you're right. I think we need to do it. I think each legislative body needs to tackle this, and we certainly would advocate for that.
We only have a few more minutes, and we have one additional contributor who I'm going to ask to say a few words now. Renaud Gaudin de Villaine is the Media Freedom and Safety of Journalists Advisor to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And perhaps he can reflect on some of the things we've heard.
Hello. So it's me again. Thank you very much for this very, again, interesting conversation with a strong testimony again. And I have to say this combination of testimony and more general remarks are very, very insightful. Maybe let me start by the most obvious, is to say that journalists in conflicts are protected by human rights, but also by humanitarian law. I would like also to recall that 20 years ago, the UN Security Council adopted the resolution 1738, which was followed in 2015 by resolution 2222. And in both resolutions, it is clearly stated that attacks against journalists are prohibited and that impunity must not prevail. I mean attacks against journalists in conflict especially. But despite that, we see that despite this strong legal framework, we see that there is clearly an implementation gap. The situation in Ukraine was mentioned, but there are other conflicts around the world which are particularly deadly for journalists. The situation in Gaza was mentioned at the very beginning in the introductory remarks. Just to tell you that as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we have a field presence in operating from Jordania to cover the Palestinian occupied territory, and since the 7th of October 2023, we documented 289 journalists killed in Gaza, to tell you the scale of what is happening there, and especially how much journalists are affected by the situation there. But we can also mention other conflict situation. I'm thinking about Sudan. Sudan is always forgotten, but this is also a place where journalists are killed on a regular basis, unfortunately. So clearly there is this implementation gap and maybe a lack of political will to implement that framework. So it's good to know that the UK will co-chairs the coalition, the international coalition, but I think it's time to remobilize, and especially on the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Resolution 1738, to remobilize like-minded states in order to put more resources, but also more political will to protect journalists. As OHCHR, in addition to this implementation gap, we see clearly there is an accountability gap that was mentioned, and the need really to support more investigative mechanisms, be they UN or outside the UN, and more also international cooperation for the preservation of evidence, which is really capital for accountability. There is also we think a prevention gap, and there is really a need for the protection of journalists to be integrated in early warning systems more systematically, and in protection of civilians' mandates at the level of the United Nations, as well as in peace operation planning. This is really something we advocate for. We think also that there is some operational protection gaps and a need for more cooperation between the UN and regional organizations, as well as civil society, and also to expand emergency relocation pathways, to support rapid response protection funds, and to invest, very important, more in the training of especially local journalists. And last but not least, like for transnational repression, this is not only about the killing or physical assaults against journalists in conflict. This is also, we see that nowadays modern warfare are hybrid, and this involves also against journalists the use of surveillance technology. And OHCHR, like many special procedures, we really advocate for a moratorium on the sale and export of surveillance technologies, and this is very, very important because many countries, even countries supporting journalists, and the protection of journalists are involved in the selling and export of surveillance technologies. We see also a lot of the use of online incitement and disinformation campaign, it was mentioned. So, and also the misuse of counterterrorism and cybersecurity, as well as more broadly national security legislation. So clearly there is a need for more reflection on how to tackle those, this multifaceted challenge, but also to mobilize states around those challenges. Just to mention, to conclude, that the special rapporteur, the current special rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression, is actually conducting consultations with civil society, but also with some UN member states in order to draft guidelines that she intends to present in June at the June session of the Human Rights Council. Guidelines to take stock of the legal protection, the legal tools to protect journalists, and also the gaps and what is needed more. She will base these guidelines on case studies, especially on the conflict in Ukraine, Gaza, and, as I mentioned, Sudan. And our idea is really to push that issue at the level of the Security Council, and maybe to organize what they call an area formula meeting at the level of the Security Council. So if you are interested in this initiative, that is, I forgot to mention very importantly, because UNESCO is in the room, this is supported by UNESCO. And if you're interested in this initiative, I can provide you with more information. Thank you.
Renaud, thank you. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists we've run slightly over, but I think well worth doing for an extremely informative session. Thank you very much.